I opened the door, and there he was, Jake, my son-in-law, standing just a breath away. The air crackled with an unspoken tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. My heart raced as I took in his dark hair, tousled and slightly damp, as if he had just stepped out of the rain. He looked up at me with those piercing blue eyes, and for a moment, time stood still. Almost a whisper. It sent a shiver down my spine. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me alone in the house, alone with Jake. "Hey," I managed to reply, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. What was happening? I could feel the question hanging in the air between us. What are we about to do? Jake took a step closer, and I could smell his cologne. A rich, intoxicating scent that wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. I could feel my pulse quicken, the chill of uncertainty turning into something warmer, something alive. My mind raced with thoughts I didn't want to entertain, yet they danced around me like a forbidden melody. "I thought I'd drop by to help with the garden," he said, a casualness in his tone that felt anything but casual. There was a challenge in his gaze, a spark that ignited a fire deep within me. I swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on my chest. "Sure, that sounds great," I replied, though my heart was screaming another story. What was I thinking? This was my son-in-law, yet all I could focus on was the way he looked at me, as if he could see parts of me that had long been hidden away. I remember the first time I really saw Jake. It was at a family gathering, a sunny afternoon filled with laughter and the scent of barbecued meat wafting through the air. He had always been my son-in-law, polite and respectful, but that day felt different. As I watched him joke with my daughter, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more simmering beneath the surface. Still, I pushed those thoughts away. We had always had a cordial relationship. But it was distant, like two ships passing in the night. For years, family gatherings were filled with small talk and laughter, but there was never a hint of attraction. Jake was always the perfect gentleman, and I was his mother-in-law. There were boundaries we both respected, but things began to change when my husband started taking longer business trips. Those weekends alone became quiet and heavy, filled with a silence that echoed through the house. I found myself looking at Jake differently, noticing the way he carried himself, the way his laughter seemed to light up the room. One evening, while I was tidying up the living room, Jake stopped by to check on me. "Hey, I thought I'd see how you're doing," he said, leaning against the doorway with that casual charm of his. There was a twinkle in his eye that I had never noticed before, and it made my heart skip a beat. "Need any help?" I smiled, a bit surprised. "I think I'm all right, but thank you." But as he stepped inside, something shifted in the air. I felt a tension that hadn't been there before, as if an invisible thread was being pulled tighter between us. We chatted about mundane things at first, but then, amidst the casual conversation, I discovered a different side of Jake. He spoke passionately about his work, his dreams, and suddenly I was captivated. "You know, I never knew you were so ambitious," I said, genuinely impressed. He shrugged, a hint of a smile on his lips. "I guess it doesn't come out much during family dinners." There was a moment of silence, and I could feel the atmosphere thickening. It was as if we were both aware of the shifting dynamic, but unsure of how to address it. I could see a new light in his eyes, and it drew me in, making my heart race. "Have you ever thought about what you want outside of all this?" he asked, his voice dropping to a softer tone. I met his gaze, feeling a flutter of excitement mixed with fear. "I don't know. I think about it sometimes. But it's complicated." "Life is complicated," he said, taking a step closer. "But it's also short. You should live for yourself." His words hung in the air, and I could feel my breath quickening. It was a casual conversation, yet it felt charged with something unnameable. I glanced away, trying to ground myself. I was his mother-in-law. This was wrong. But as I looked back at him, I saw a different Jake. A man who was no longer just my son-in-law, but someone I found myself strangely attracted to. "Maybe I need to take a few risks," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Jake's eyes sparkled with something I couldn't quite place. "Sometimes risks lead to the best adventures," he said, and I felt the weight of his words. The way he looked at me sent shivers down my spine. There was a question hanging in the air, unspoken yet palpable. What are we about to do? That night, I lay awake, the darkness wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. My mind kept drifting back to Jake's words. I remembered the laughter from that family gathering, the way he had looked at me, not just as family but as a woman. It was bewildering and thrilling. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. The next few weeks felt different. Every time Jake came by, I sensed a change. He was more playful, his touches lingering a bit longer than they used to. During one of our chats, he casually brushed his fingers against my arm, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "You okay?" he asked, concern flashing in his eyes. "I'm fine," I replied, trying to mask the thrill coursing through me. But I wasn't fine. I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't fully grasp. The tension between us escalated, and I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if I let my guard down. Then came the invitation that turned everything upside down. "How about a drink?" he suggested one evening, his voice smooth and inviting. "Just you and me. Your husband is away after all." I hesitated, my heart racing. "Jake, are you sure that's a good idea?" He smiled, a devilish glint in his eyes. "It's just a drink. What's the worst that could happen?" I knew the answer to that question, yet I found myself nodding. "Okay, let's do it." As soon as the words left my mouth, a thrill of excitement shot through me. Something was changing, and I was ready to see where it would lead. I couldn't help but feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to leap into the unknown. The air was thick with anticipation, and as I prepared for our night out, I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. This was not just a drink. It was the beginning of something I could no longer ignore. I'm not sure how to describe that day when I opened the door and saw him standing there. Jake, my son-in-law, was leaning against the door frame with that casual confidence that had always intrigued me. My heart raced as I processed the sight of him, his dark hair slightly tousled, his shirt fitting just right. I could feel the air thicken, a tension that seemed to pulse between us. My husband was away on a business trip, and the house felt emptier than usual. "Hey, I hope I'm not interrupting," Jake said, his voice smooth and warm. The way he looked at me, with those deep-set eyes, sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about his gaze that held me captive, a silent question hanging in the air. "What are we about to do?" "No, not at all," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter, and as he brushed past me, I felt the faintest touch of his arm on mine. It was a simple gesture, but it ignited something deep within me, something I didn't want to acknowledge. We had always shared a cordial yet distant relationship, one built on family gatherings and polite conversations. I remembered the holidays where he'd laugh and mingle with everyone, the attraction always lurking beneath the surface but never daring to show itself. But everything changed when my husband began spending more time away. It was as if the distance opened a door I never knew existed. "Can I get you a drink?" I offered, trying to keep my voice steady as I led him to the kitchen. "Sure, that would be nice," he replied, his smile disarming. I poured 2 glasses of wine, attempting to steady my nerves. As I handed him a glass, our fingers brushed, and I felt a jolt of electricity that made my heart race. "Thanks," he said, taking a sip. His eyes were locked onto mine, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. "You know, it's been nice having you around while your husband is out. It feels different." "Different how?" I asked. My curiosity piqued, despite the warning bells ringing in my head. "I don't know," he said, his voice dropping to a lower tone. More relaxed, I guess, like we can actually talk. I nodded, feeling the tension build as we engaged in small talk, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something unspoken that hung between us. The way he leaned closer, the way his voice changed, each moment made it harder to deny the chemistry that was crackling in the air. "Maybe we should grab a drink together sometime, just the 2 of us," Jake suggested, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Are you serious?" I asked, half laughing, half intrigued. "Why not? It could be fun," he shrugged. But there was a challenge in his tone that sent a thrill through me. The invitation hung there, heavy and tempting. I could feel the pull towards him, the sense that something was shifting between us. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I replied, trying to sound firm. but knowing that part of me was curious, excited even. "Come on, it's just a drink." "No one needs to know. Just a little summer fun while your husband is away," he pushed, and the way he said it felt like a dare. I hesitated, my mind racing. I thought about my husband and the life we had built together, but there was something about Jake that drew me in, a spark that felt dangerously alive. "All right, maybe just one drink," I finally said, surprising myself with my own words. "Perfect," he grinned, and I felt my heart flutter. Little did I know that simple decision would set off a chain of events I could never have predicted. As the days passed, the excitement grew. Each time we exchanged glances, the air felt charged, electric. I found myself thinking about him more than I should have, replaying our conversations in my mind. The casual touches became more frequent, more lingering, each one igniting a fire I had long kept buried. It was during one of those moments, as he brushed his fingers against my arm, that a new kind of awareness washed over me. His voice was low and inviting as he said, "You know, I've always thought you were beautiful." His words sent a thrill through me, one that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I could feel my heart racing, caught in this web of desire and fear. How did we get here? What were we doing? In that moment, I realized that everything was about to change. The boundaries I had carefully maintained were beginning to blur, and I was standing on the brink of something I could not take back. The question loomed larger than ever. What are we about to do? And as I looked into Jake's eyes, I knew we were about to cross a line. Neither of us had the courage to acknowledge until now. I remember that night vividly. The air was thick with tension, and I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I opened the door. There he was. Jake, my son-in-law. Standing there with that familiar, boyish charm. It felt strange to see him waiting for me, his expression, a mix of determination and something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. My husband was away on a business trip, and the absence of his presence hung heavily in the air, creating an almost electric atmosphere between us. "Hi, I thought I'd check in on you," Jake said casually. But there was an intensity in his eyes that made me feel exposed. I forced a smile, trying to play it cool, but my stomach churned with a mix of excitement and apprehension. I wondered, was this innocent? Or were we crossing a line that should remain uncrossed? "Thanks for stopping by," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside to let him in, the door closing with a quiet click that felt like a finality. We stood there in the hallway, the distance between us charged with unsaid words. I could feel his gaze on me, devouring every inch, and it made me shiver. Did he know what I was thinking? Did he feel it too? As we moved to the living room, I tried to focus on the project I needed help with. We had spoken about it casually before, but now it felt different. I could hardly concentrate. Jake's presence was overwhelming, and every time he brushed against me, it sent a jolt of electricity through my body. I could see the way he looked at me, as if he was trying to read my thoughts, and I found myself wondering what we were really doing there together, alone. "Do you need help with anything specific?" he asked, his voice low and inviting. I could feel my cheeks flush, and I turned my head away, suddenly aware of how close he was. I could almost smell his cologne, a warm, spicy scent that wrapped around me like a blanket. "I just need to finish this," I mumbled, gesturing to the papers scattered across the table. But my mind was racing, and the words felt hollow. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and I caught his gaze lingering on my lips for a moment too long. Time slipped away as we worked side by side, the tension building with every shared glance. I could sense the shift in the atmosphere, the way our bodies subconsciously leaned closer together. I felt a strange thrill at the thought of being so near him, a thrill that was both exhilarating and frightening. Then it happened. We both reached for the same piece of paper, our hands brushing against each other. The world around us faded, and I felt a sudden heat rise in my cheeks. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. It was as if we were the only two people in existence, and the weight of what was happening hung heavy in the air. "Jenna," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper, but it was enough to send shivers down my spine. I shouldn't feel this way, but I do." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Jake, we can't. This isn't right. But even as I said it, I could see the resolve in his eyes, the way he leaned in slightly, as if daring me to pull away. He took a step closer, and I could feel the heat radiating off him. What if we just kissed? Just once? It doesn't have to mean anything. His words hung in the air, and I could feel my breath hitch in my throat. A part of me wanted to push him away, but another part, a darker, more adventurous part, wanted to lean into that moment, to explore the forbidden territory we stood on. Before I could respond, he closed the gap between us, cupping my face in his hands. The kiss was unexpected, a rush of sensation that ignited every nerve in my body. It was soft at first, a gentle brush of lips that quickly deepened into something more fervent. I felt my knees weaken, and I couldn't help but melt into him, surrendering to the moment. As we pulled away, breathless and wide-eyed, I knew that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. The kiss had sealed our fate, binding us in a secret that would change everything. I could see the mix of triumph and mischief in his eyes, and I felt a rush of exhilaration mixed with guilt. What had we just done? "Now we really can't go back," he said, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream, but all I could do was stand there, heart racing, caught in a whirlwind of emotions. I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous and thrilling, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to jump or pull back. "Jake, we need to think about this," I stammered, but deep down I felt a flicker of excitement. The thrill of the unknown pulled me in, and I knew that this was just the beginning of something I never thought I would want. I opened the door, and there he was. Jake, my son-in-law, standing there with an intensity in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. He had an easy smile, but today it felt charged, almost electric. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. My husband was away on a business trip, and suddenly the air in the room felt thick with unspoken words. "Hey," Jake said, his voice low and inviting as he stepped inside. I could sense a shift, a tension that had never been there before. I closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Was it excitement or fear? I couldn't tell. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I tried to act casual to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel the pulse of something forbidden between us. What were we doing? I was his mother-in-law and he was my daughter's husband. Yet today, everything felt different. Jake moved closer, and I could see the way his gaze lingered on me. A hint of mischief dancing in his eyes. "Not at all," I managed to say, my heart racing. I gestured towards the living room, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But as he followed me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. We settled on the couch, a space that had always felt safe and familiar. But now, with Jake sitting beside me, the boundaries began to blur. I could smell his cologne, a mix of cedar and warmth, and it enveloped me like a soft blanket. It was comforting, yet thrilling, and I found myself leaning in just a fraction more than I should. "So, how have you been?" I asked, trying to fill the silence that felt so charged. It was a simple question, but I knew it was loaded with implications. "Busy with work and family," Jake replied, his eyes searching mine. "But I've been thinking about you. I know it's a bit strange, but I feel like we've always had a connection, don't you?" His words hung in the air and I felt my breath catch. Did he really just say that? My heart raced as I fought to maintain my composure. "I suppose we get along well," I said, trying to play it down, but inside a storm was brewing. "More than that," he insisted, leaning closer. "I mean, I've always admired you. You're amazing, you know?" I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. "Thank you, Jake." "That's sweet of you to say." But the compliment only made my heart pound louder. The question lingered in the back of my mind. "What are we doing?" As we talked, the conversation flowed easily, but the tension was palpable. Every laugh we shared felt like a secret, every glance charged with unacknowledged desire. I caught myself stealing glances at his lips, wondering what it would feel like to kiss him, an idea that both excited and terrified me. The minutes turned into hours as we reminisced about family gatherings, shared stories, and joked about the absurdities of life. Yet beneath the surface, the air crackled with an undeniable attraction that neither of us dared to name. Then, without thinking, I reached out to touch his arm. A casual gesture that sent a jolt of electricity through me. He looked down at my hand, and I could see the flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of surprise and longing. "Did you just?" he started, his voice trailing off as he met my gaze. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, pulling my hand back, but it was too late. The moment hung between us like a fragile glass ornament, ready to shatter. "Maybe we should stop," he suggested. But there was a spark of hope in his voice, as if he was waiting for me to push back. "Maybe," I echoed, but I didn't move away. Instead, I leaned in closer, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. The question danced in my mind. What are we doing? But the answer felt too complicated to face. Before I knew it, the space between us vanished, and Jake's fingers brushed against my cheek. "I've wanted to do this for so long," he admitted, his breath warm against my skin. "Jake." I started, but the protest died in my throat as he closed the distance. His lips met mine in a soft, tentative kiss that ignited a fire inside me. It was a kiss filled with the weight of our choices, but in that moment, all I could feel was him. I melted into him, surrendering to the thrill of the moment. There was no turning back now. We had crossed a line, and the thrill of that knowledge sent shivers through me. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, a heady mix of excitement and fear. As we pulled apart, reality crashed in around us. I looked into his eyes and I could see the same confusion mirrored there. "What are we doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know," he said, a mix of uncertainty and desire in his gaze. "But I can't stop thinking about you. Neither could I." And just like that, a new world opened up before me, filled with temptation and danger. A world where everything I knew could change in an instant. "I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that." I stepped through the door, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't quite understand. The moment I opened it, there he was, Jake, my son-in-law, standing in my living room, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I had expected to find solitude, perhaps the remnants of my day lingering in the silence. Instead, I found him waiting, his presence immediately filling the air with a tension I had never felt before. A casual smile playing on his lips, but there was an intensity in his gaze that sent a chill down my spine. I could feel my breath hitch slightly, caught between surprise and something deeper, something that terrified me. "Jake, what are you doing here?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. I caught myself glancing towards the clock. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt too small. I just thought, maybe we could talk? I hope you don't mind. His tone was light, but the way he looked at me suggested that he was hoping for more than just a conversation. I stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze and the unspoken question that lingered between us. What are we about to do? Every family gathering flashed through my mind. The shared laughs, the polite exchanges, the distance that had always been there. I had never thought of Jake in any way other than as my daughter's husband. Yet now, standing before him, I felt an unsettling shift in the air, a crack in the facade of normalcy that had defined our relationship. "Sure, we can talk," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. As I stepped aside to let him in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. We moved to the living room and I could feel the tension building. Jake took a seat, his posture relaxed, but there was an energy swirling between us that felt electric. It made me acutely aware of how alone we were. I shifted in my seat, trying to push away the thoughts that intruded on my mind. "What's on your mind?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "I don't know. I guess I just wanted to check in on you. You've been on my mind a lot lately," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. I could see the way he watched me, his eyes searching for something. "Me? Why?" I asked, feigning ignorance, but inside I knew. I could feel the heat creeping up my cheeks and I hated that I was blushing, that he could see the effect he had on me. "Because you're always so strong. I can see how hard it must be sometimes. Especially with your husband traveling so much," he said, leaning slightly closer. I was hyper-aware of the distance between us shrinking, the air thickening with an unnameable tension. As we talked, The conversation drifted to more personal topics. I found myself opening up to him in ways I hadn't intended. It was easy to forget our boundaries. Easy to lose myself in his gaze. There was a spark of something daring in our exchange, an undeniable chemistry that flickered beneath the surface. "Do you ever feel lonely?" he asked suddenly, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "It's hard when he's away for long stretches." "I can imagine," Jake replied, his voice softening. "You deserve to feel wanted, you know." I swallowed, unsure of how to respond. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. It was a dangerous line we were dancing along, and I could feel myself teetering on the edge. Then it happened. As he reached out to touch my arm, his fingers brushed against my skin. A mere accident, or so I tried to convince myself. But the moment his skin met mine, a jolt of electricity surged through me. I looked up, our eyes locking, and the world around us faded away. "Jake," I started, but the words died in my throat as he leaned closer, the space between us evaporating. I could see the desire in his eyes, raw and unfiltered. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his breath warm against my cheek. The question hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation all at once. I knew I should say no. I should push him away and remind him of the lines we couldn't cross. But instead, I found myself nodding, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, testing the waters of this new territory we were exploring. But as it deepened, it became something else entirely. Passionate, desperate, as if we were both starved for this connection we had never allowed out ourselves to acknowledge. In that moment, everything else faded away. I was no longer a mother-in-law caught in a web of societal expectations. I was simply a woman surrendering to the heat of the moment. As we pulled apart, breathless, reality crashed back in. What had we just done? I could feel the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I looked at Jake, and for the first time I saw not just my son-in-law, but a man who awakened something deep within me. The thrill of what we had just shared was intoxicating, yet a wave of guilt washed over me. I was betraying my husband, my family, but as I looked into Jake's eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The lines we had drawn were no longer clear, and I found myself yearning for more. I stood in front of the door, my heart racing as I prepared to open it. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not Jake. My husband was away on a business trip, and I had settled into the quiet of the evening, ready to watch a mindless show on television. But when I opened the door, there he was. Jake, my son-in-law, stood on the threshold, looking surprisingly handsome in a fitted shirt that accentuated his lean physique, yet it sent shivers down my spine. "Jake, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed my surprise. "I thought I would check in on you. I know it can get lonely when Mark is away," he replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air thickened with tension. I could feel it wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. I momentarily forgot how to breathe, my mind racing with thoughts of what this could mean. He was my son-in-law, and I was married. But the way he looked at me, with those intense eyes, sent a chill of excitement through me that I could hardly ignore. "Do you want to sit?" I gestured toward the living room, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Sure," he replied, following me. As I walked ahead, I could sense his gaze on my back, a warmth that made me feel both desired and scared. Once we settled on the couch, we talked about mundane things, family updates, the latest news, the weather. Yet, beneath the surface, I could feel an undercurrent, a silent question lingering between us. What were we about to do? "I brought you something," Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence. He reached into his bag and pulled out a bottle of wine. "Thought we could share it. Just a little something to ease the loneliness." I hesitated for a moment. Is that a good idea? Why not? It's just a drink between family, right? His smile was disarming and I felt my resolve wavering. "Okay then," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Let's have a glass." As he poured the wine, I couldn't shake off the thrill of it all. I kept reminding myself that this was just a casual visit, but my body betrayed me. I felt a flutter in my stomach, a mix of anticipation and fear. I took a sip, the rich taste swirling in my mouth, and as I glanced at him, our eyes locked for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The conversation flowed more easily after that, and I found myself leaning closer, hanging on to his every word. I remembered the family gatherings where we had always shared polite smiles, but never crossed any lines. But tonight felt different. The absence of my husband created a space where anything seemed possible. Do you ever feel trapped in your life? He suddenly asked, his tone shifting to something more serious. Sometimes, I admitted, surprised by the honesty in my voice. I think everyone does at some point. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. It can be suffocating, can it? Especially when you're expected to play a role. The intensity of his gaze made my heart race. What do you mean? You know, the perfect wife, the perfect mother. But what about your desires? What about what you want? His words struck a chord deep within me. I had spent so many years fulfilling expectations, buried under the weight of my responsibilities. I guess I've never really thought about it, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake leaned closer, his hand brushing against my arm. You deserve to feel alive, to feel wanted. I shivered at his touch, feeling a rush of excitement and fear. We shouldn't. But before I could finish my thought, he interrupted me, his voice soft yet insistent. Just one moment, one connection. Just between us. The tension in the air shifted as he moved even closer. In that moment, something inside me broke free. I felt my carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. What if someone sees us? Let them, he said, his voice steady. This is about us. And just like that, the world outside faded away. The warmth of his breath brushed against my skin as he moved in closer. And then our lips met, igniting a fire within me I had long thought extinguished. It was unexpected, electric, and terrifyingly exhilarating all at once. I pulled away, staring into his eyes, searching for any sign of regret. Instead, I found only desire reflected back at me. I whispered, my heart racing. Something we both need, he replied, his voice low and husky. As I sat there, heart pounding in my chest, I realized that I was standing on the precipice of something I never expected. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, but the thrill of the moment overshadowed the fear. I had crossed a line and there was no turning back.